Yes, I have had a burning compassion for many people whose religions have been despised, and a burning concern to promote mutual respect and understanding amongst the religions of the world, whilst at all times remaining a Christian and grounded within one or another of the traditions of that faith. It's a very interesting kind of thing. I didn't know I was going to wind up doing that. God's funny in the way she sometimes calls people into activity, and you only find out a whole lot further down the track what's up. Having been raised in a tiny group that thought it was the only true church on earth, there were about 300,000 of us at that point. Excellent education, not narrow, totally committed to all sorts of things, but quite narrow in their views of others. I found that difficult. My father, like me, a sociologist who occasionally preached. I, a sociologist and a theologian who probably never stops preaching. He took me into Chicago, and I saw many faiths and many races, and I saw oppression, and my heart was moved. And I encountered people of different faiths who shared my concerns and whose faiths were interesting. But we could work together. And I could learn from them, and they enriched me. And I hope sometimes I enriched them. And that continued on through my journey as my range of experience expanded. That's terribly important in terms of understanding faith, understanding your own faith. I always discovered I was a better Christian when I was with non-Christians. Often it kept me on my toes. They would ask me questions. Oh, that happens in interfaith circles, by the way. People will say, well, what do you think? It's a bit frightening to Australians who don't like being challenged in some ways, but you have to be articulate. And that's one of the challenges, and that's what happens. People come away renewed in their own faith, comfortable with others, but more centered and grounded in where they stand themselves. That's a terribly important model. I have been struggling of late to develop a theology of interfaith. I'm not entirely pleased. I love some of the wonderful liberal Christian theologies of the 20th century. Deeply warm my heart. Not entirely adequate to stand up to the kinds of challenges being placed by those who argue against interfaith, and they abound. Within both our churches, there are those who say you shouldn't do it, or that some other religious groups are evil, or you know this line. And so developing such a theology takes some work. You can do it out of the goodness of your heart, and that's probably enough motivation for anyone, but being a theologian, I got to have other reasons. And so I scour and scurry through the Bible, which I love and find great nurture from. I love the story of the Tower of Babel, because here these people were saying, one way to God, and God goes, no, we'll have diversity, thank you very much. Creation's full of diversity. What's this one-way stuff? And what God is it but that God of compassionate, outpouring love? Unconditional love, whose love is poured on these babies who've done nothing to earn it, whose perfection is probably already marred in the eyes of their parents somewhat, somewhere along the way. We all know it who have children. And yet that prevenient grace of God goes to these children and says, you're mine, I'm yours, I will not let you go. What a God. What an image. Baptism is the most wonderfully powerful Christian symbol of the outpouring love of a compassionate God. But then we had that gospel story. Yes, I'm responsible for the readings this morning. That story is, to me, one of the most foundational building blocks of a theology of interfaith relations. And you say, how are you going to get there, Bouma? Well, hang on. It's going to be a little bit of a ride. Because I love that story. The gospel stories, particularly when they're talking about Jesus' encounters, nobody's going to write a story like that. Nobody's going to invent it. It's got too many hairy bits that don't fit, that don't make sense, that aren't nice. So we've got Jesus in some Samaritan town, Sychar. The disciples have nicked off to get some takeaway. He's sitting by the well, and some woman comes to draw some water, and he says, hey, I could use some water. And she says, what are you doing talking to me? We're going to get in trouble. I'm going to get in trouble. You're going to get in trouble. The whole town's going to be talking. You want to get, tongues wagging. In that area of the world at that time, probably do it pretty well right now, a single man talking to a single woman out in a somewhat public place, but somewhat deserted. They're in trouble. He says, what are you doing? And they start bantering a bit about water. But they're beginning to engage things of faith. They're beginning to have a discussion about faith. And then, comes that, how rude, how utterly rude this Jesus is, who says, oh, go get your husband. And she says, I haven't got one. He said, I know, you had 5. Is that what it's about? Middle Ages had a field day with this, okay? Since they want to write women out of the scriptures, well, here's one that goes right there. I mean, heavens, what else do you need? Multiple married person, gone. Fortunately, we've done a lot of healing on that one recently in historical times. Is that what it's about? Patricia and I were traveling in the Middle East. This Palestinian Christian was our guide and was calling attention to this and to that. And out of the blue, he said, you know that story? Do you know that word for husband in Aramaic? Do you know what it is? I'd done Hebrew and Greek and stuff, but my Aramaic was pretty rusty. He says, it's Baal. Baal, the word for God. Now, it's nice if you want to develop a lovely theology of husbands being gods. Yeah. And in the language, a husband was a god was a god, and the terms were kind of, okay. But if Jesus said, let's talk about your God. Let's bring God into this discussion. Why would he do that with a woman, any person? Because that's what Jesus did. He was always talking about the presence of God and trying to help people to come to a new understanding of what that presence was about and what that God was about. And she said, and then this discussion around 5 gods. How does that fit? Well, let's go back to Samaritans. Samaritans were despised by the people of Jesus' day. The Jews hated the Samaritans with only the kind of hatred that can happen between siblings of the one God. The Samaritans were sort of leftover people who hadn't been taken away from the northern 10 tribes, some of whom may have come back. And when the Judeans returned from Babylon, they scorned those who hadn't gone. And they scorned their religion, which had taken a slightly different tracking than the one that went to Babylon and came back, which had tracked a slightly different way. Oh, slight difference. We're good about that. God hates you. And then there's this discussion about worship. So it comes up. Our ancestors say worship here in Mount Gerizim. You say you've got to worship in Jerusalem. Oh, doesn't that sound familiar? The kind of arguments we get into, interfaith arguments.